Okay, let's get started. Welcome to this webinar event by Apt Associates, New Findings on Expanding Registered Apprenticeship Opportunities in the U.S. to All Job Seekers and Employers. How did American Apprenticeship Initiative Apprentices and Employers fare? It's quite a title we got there. We're happy to have you join us for the next hour and a half or so. My name is David Kaz. I'm a principal with Apt, and I will be moderating today. Let's go to the next slide here. So before we get started, some webinar basics that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. I believe everyone should be muted, but just in case, if you can make sure you are muted throughout the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please enter them in the chat and someone will work with you to resolve those. We will have about 15 minutes or so for questions at the end of the webinar. We will take those via chat, so feel free to enter those as they occur to you. If you are asking questions in the chat, it's directed to a specific presenter or a group of presenters. If you want to indicate that, it makes us able to get it to the right person. We are recording the webinar to make it available to everyone later, along with a copy of the PowerPoint. So you'll have that as well as any links that we're going to share. So let's go to the next slide. So the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss registered apprenticeship as a viable workforce opportunity for job seekers and employers, including for non-traditional apprentices and for non-traditional employers, so employers outside of the trades. We also want to introduce findings from an important national study of registered apprenticeship programs. And we're going to hear from representatives of employer trainer partnerships on how they developed their apprenticeship programs and what the outcomes were for those. We're also going to share links to reports and materials so you can do some more reading and digging on your own into this topic. Next slide. So the topics for today, we're going to cover what is registered apprenticeship and what is the American Apprenticeship Initiative, who participated in the Registered Apprenticeship Initiative, did AAI grantees reach traditionally underserved populations and employers in non-traditional industries. After we cover those topics in the research, we're going to go to our expert panel who are going to discuss those topics from their perspective. Then we are going to go back to the research and what we uncovered in terms of the benefits of apprenticeship for apprentices and for employers. And then we're going to go to our panel again to talk about the benefits that they specifically experienced. And then we will go to our Q&A. Again, that will be about 15 minutes at the end. Let's go to the next slide. So before we dig in, we have a couple of questions for you. We'd like to know a little bit more about you. So we'd like you to spend a few seconds, maybe a minute, responding to this first poll question. We can open that if it's not already open. And that is what type of organization you represent. And just give us your best answer. There are quite a few choices here, so hopefully something will fit. If you want to select one, you may need to scroll down after you select to make sure that you see all the choices there on the right. And then at the very bottom, you're going to see the send green button. I think we can probably close the poll at this point. So let's see what we got. Oh, I saw some answers there on the right. It looked like government was the number one. Since we can't see the results, let's go to the second poll question on the next slide. So before we dive into our research findings on apprenticeship, we want to know what first springs to mind for you when you think of the word apprenticeship. We can open that poll. And this is a word cloud, so if you want to enter just what one or maybe two words spring to mind. Are we having trouble with the poll? Oh, here it comes. There you go. There's a word box there on the right if you want to enter a word or two. And then you can hit send. See, we're getting some in the chat as well. Let's give it maybe 10 more seconds. Okay, it looks like we can probably close the poll. So it looks like we have training, opportunity, mentorship, learning, on-the-job training are some of our top answers there. That's great. Thank you for participating. We have one more poll at the end, but right now let's introduce our speakers. So if we can go to the next slide. So beginning with our AI research team, first we have Lizzie Copson, Senior Associate, and Doug Walton, Associate with Apt Associates. Apt is a global consulting and research firm that combines data and bold thinking to improve the quality of people's lives, including a significant body of work researching, evaluating, and providing technical assistance in the workforce and economic mobility arena. We're also joined by Daniel Keene, Principal Research Associate with Urban Institute. Urban is a nonprofit policy research organization based in Washington, D.C. Urban researchers have considerable expertise in registered apprenticeship, including their collaboration with APT on the recently completed AAI evaluation. Next slide. We have an amazing panel of experts today as well, trainers and employers who partner to implement apprenticeship programs that were part of AAI. So starting there on the left, we have Melissa Schiavelli, Director of Workforce Development Programs with MassHire Hampton County Workforce Board in Springfield, Massachusetts. Since 1980, MassHire has led a dynamic, efficient, and integrated workforce development system that promotes economic development and community growth and is rooted in the principles of equity and increased access to workforce development services for employers and job seekers. We also have Diane Toya, Senior Workforce Planning Partner with Bay State Health, which was the employer partner to MassHire in the AAI program. Bay State Health's mission is to improve the health of people in their community every day with quality and compassion. With a focus on quality, safety, value, and experience, Bay State is not only a keystone of their region, but they are also a national leader in healthcare. We are also joined by Debbie Hopkins. Formerly, she was the Chief Workforce Officer of Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board. She is currently the Director of Workforce Initiatives with Aption. Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board is one of 15 local workforce boards in Virginia, focused on Northwestern Virginia. They ranked third in performance among the 46 AAI grantees with over 1,000 new apprentices employed with 93 employer sponsors. Their pre-apprenticeship initiative with Wilson Workforce Rehabilitation Center and a Hershey Boot Camp were recognized as a national best practice, shared in numerous conference presentations with the Department of Labor. And finally, we have Christy Branch, training coordinator with the Hershey Company, which was the employer partner to Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board in the AAI program. Hershey's Stewart's Draft, Virginia location is their second largest plant in the U.S. Hershey celebrated its 40th year anniversary in the Shenandoah Valley this year and is one of the area's largest employer. Little known fact that Milton S. Hershey was an apprentice himself 125 years ago, and the company has a strong culture of employee development, including through apprenticeship. So those are our great speakers that we have lined up for today, and now I would like to turn it over to APT's Lizzie Copson. Lizzie?
Great, thank you, David. I'll start by sharing the context for registered apprenticeship and the AAI evaluation. Apprenticeships are structured workplace programs that combine technical instruction with on-the-job learning overseen by a mentor who's someone proficient in the occupation. Employers hire apprentices and pay them progressively higher wages as their skills increase. Apprenticeships are developed in specific occupations. The skills gained are applicable to that particular occupation and can be transferred to the same one for a different employer. Other countries have used apprenticeship much more than the United States. So less than 0.5% of Americans participate in registered apprenticeship compared to 2 to 4% of workers in other countries like Germany, Canada, and England. Next slide. A registered apprenticeship is one that has been approved by the U.S. Department of Labor or a DOL-approved state apprenticeship agency. Approval means the program meets certain federal and state standards. Specifically, it has 2,000 hours or more of on-the-job learning supervised by a mentor and a minimum of 144 hours of related technical instruction. It results in an industry-recognized credential, and it includes structured wage increases along the way. All of this is memorialized in the Standards of Apprenticeship, and that's a document that the Department of Labor or a state apprenticeship agency approves. All apprenticeships developed under the AAI grants had to be registered apprenticeships. Next slide. In 2015, the Department of Labor awarded 46 grants to state government agencies, workforce boards, community and technical colleges, and sector-based organizations. The grants operated through September of 2021. The initiative was designed to expand registered apprenticeship into sectors with few apprenticeships, such as healthcare, IT, and advanced manufacturing. It was also designed to expand registered apprenticeship opportunities for populations underrepresented in apprenticeship, which the grant announcement defined as women, people of color, people with disabilities, and veterans. Next slide. DOL contracted with Apt Associates and its partners to evaluate the AAI grants with the goal of building evidence about the effectiveness of apprenticeship for participants and employers. 45 grantees were in the study. One grant ended before the evaluation started. And the evaluation included 4 sub-studies: an implementation study, an apprentice outcome study, an employer return on investment study, and an employer engagement demonstration. Today's presentation focuses primarily on the apprentice outcomes and employer ROI studies, but we touch on some findings from the other studies as well. Next slide. In this section, we give a sense of the demographic characteristics of AAI apprentices, the occupations they were hired into, and the employers that hired them. Next slide. So this exhibit shows selected characteristics of AAI apprentices, and that's the orange bars, compared to the characteristics of all U.S. registered apprentices, so the teal bars. It uses data from a survey of 2,600 AAI apprentices and data from Rapids, which is a national apprenticeship database. The main takeaway is that in general, relative to all U.S. apprentices, more AAI apprentices were from underrepresented populations. So just to highlight a few of the findings on this chart, on the far left, we see that 61% of AAI apprentices were from any underrepresented population. In contrast, 46% of all U.S. registered apprentices in Rapids are from an underrepresented population, and that's a difference of 15 percentage points. Compared to all registered apprentices in the U.S., AAI apprenticeships had larger shares of women apprentices, so 25% versus 9%, and Black apprentices, 17% versus 11%. AAI apprentices were 4 years older on average than all registered apprentices, so 33 years compared to 29 years, as we see in the far right set of bars. Next slide. We also found that most AAI apprentices enrolled in non-traditional occupations. Historically, registered apprenticeships have primarily been in construction, plumbing, and other so-called building trades. We found that for AAI construction, so looking at the top bar and then the teal section in particular, so construction accounted for just 1/4 of all AAI apprentices. 3/4 of apprentices enrolled in a non-traditional, so that is a non-construction occupation. There are some interesting differences by subgroup. So healthcare, the set of green bars, was much more common for women than men, so 52% of women compared to just 2% of men. Construction, the teal set of bars, was most common for Hispanic apprentices at 41%. And other race apprentices, looking at the bottom row of the chart, were more likely than all other groups to participate in healthcare, IT, and other occupations. Next slide. The previous slide showed apprenticeship occupations as reported by grantees. These charts use data from a survey of 68 employers that registered apprentices under the AAI grants. And Daniel will talk more about that survey's findings later when we talk about return on investment. While the top chart relies on a much smaller number of survey responses than the previous slide, we see here too that AAI grantees recruited employers in a variety of industries that have not traditionally used apprenticeship. The bottom chart gives a sense of employer size and again shows variation. 3/4 of employers had 100 or more full-time equivalent workers, with close to 1/3 of employers having more than 500 full-time equivalent workers. And then some, about 1/4, were also smaller businesses with less than 100 FTEs. Next slide. Employers are critical to registered apprenticeships since they hire and provide on-the-job learning for apprentices. But for a variety of reasons, it can be challenging to sell employers on the apprenticeship model. We tested a consultative sales approach to recruiting employers to determine whether it had an impact on employers' registration of apprenticeship programs. That approach emphasizes communicating the value of apprenticeship to employers in a way that resonates with them and tailoring assistance to the employer's needs to help them develop and register a program. The Institute for American Apprenticeship trained 2 AAI grantees on how to implement the approach, and one of them, MassHire-Hampden County, is on our panel today. After one of the grantees implemented the approach, 12% of the employers they contacted registered a program, and employers registered a total of 5 programs and 137 apprentices into those programs during the study period. And now I'll turn it back to David for the panelist discussion.
Great. Thank you, Lizzie, very much. So yes, now we're going to transition from the research to our expert panel who are part of the AAI project. Again, just to refresh your memory, and for those who joined late, we're joined by Melissa Schiavelli from MassHire-Hampden County Workforce Board, Diane Toya, Bay State Health, Debbie Hopkins, who is formerly with Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board and is currently with Aption, and Christy Branch from the Hershey Company. So I invite them to come on to screen if they don't mind. And let's start our questions with our workforce training partners. And let's start with Melissa. If you could provide a very brief background on MassHire and your apprenticeship program that was part of the AAI project.
Sure. Thank you, David. Thank you, Lizzie, too, for the great explanation in terms of the data and information. I work for MassHire-Hampden County Workforce Board located in Springfield, Mass. We were a subrecipient of the Mass Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development's AAI grant, and at the time focused primarily on advanced manufacturing. We're one of 16 workforce boards in the state of Massachusetts. And just quickly, from February 2019 through December 2020, we implemented the consultative sales approach, employer prospecting, and the demonstration study. And that was basically 50 employers engaged in advanced manufacturing, 25 were part of a control, 25 a treatment group. So we utilized that 17-month period of time to focus in on our treatment group. And the statistics that Lizzie provided beforehand shows kind of how that broke down. One thing I just want to say quickly before we get into it, it's important to know that Massachusetts had just embarked on non-traditional trades. So in 2018, non-traditional trades became part of our state agency, and MassHire-Hampden County Workforce Board was one of the first workforce boards in the state to become a sponsor. Obviously, as a tool to train and upskill workers, it became critical for the workforce development system to be a part of registered apprenticeships. So it was new to our employers, but also new to us. And we had an opportunity to work with Jerry Ghazi, who is a national registered apprenticeship guru, so to speak. And really, not only during that 17 months, but I don't think we realized how much the entire experience was going to propel apprenticeship programs in the state of Massachusetts, but it certainly has. So thanks, David.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Debbie, same question. If you could just provide a very high-level background on Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board and the AAI apprenticeship that we're talking about today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So as you mentioned, we are also a workforce board, one of 15 in Virginia, and we had received over $19 million in discretionary grants that included the AAI, and had good experience, close employer relationships, and very good experience in implementing regional workforce initiatives. And through a previous grant, we had some good experience with registered apprenticeship. So that helped us understand what apprenticeship was, and then through the close relationship with employers, we could see the critical workforce shortages. So we had a team together to develop the proposal, and we believe that was one of the keys in being so successful, is having a team from the very beginning who could identify the critical workforce shortages in the advanced manufacturing industry, which is still the #1 industry in that region. And what we could do with pre-apprenticeship and some just interesting pilots to see what we could do to help address that issue.
Great, thanks, Debbie. So we'd like to learn more about what strategies you found were effective marketing your apprenticeship program, both to your employer partners and also to job seekers. So starting with employers, and let's start with you, Debbie. What steps did you follow to build a new partnership with Hershey to develop the new apprenticeship program? How did you first approach them, and what was the process like from there?
Well, you couldn't have a better partner than Hershey, because one of the #1 issues is that the company has to have a training culture. If they don't have a training culture, then you're really beating your head against the wall and trying to get a good apprenticeship program developed, because that's just not in the heart of the company. It certainly was with Hershey. So Hershey was well known in the area, that one of the biggest employers, had high wages, a great reputation, and they already had an apprenticeship program for maintenance. So our approach with Hershey was twofold. First, we were looking for that entry manufacturing position, the industrial manufacturing technician, and looking to come up with a pre-apprenticeship for individuals with disabilities that could really work well to have these individuals work ready and be able to join in an apprenticeship program. So that's really how it started. Hershey was active in the Wilson Workforce Rehabilitation Center's Employer Advisory Committee. They were already active in that, and already active in the community, and already had that culture. So there were very, very positive reasons to work with them. And then there was the absolute golden gift of Christy Branch, who you'll hear from soon.
Okay, thanks. And just to follow up on that, Debbie, based on your experience with Hershey, or really any apprenticeship that you've worked on, what are the key selling points and strategies to engage employers to get involved? We probably have other training organizations listening in that want employer partners. What do you think really sold them on working with you?
Well, I would say for a lot of employers, we had 23 employers in this grant that started apprenticeship programs, 23, and others, and 50, I think, who had added occupations to their portfolio. So my background is also in HR for many years. And what employers are looking for, they're not looking to adopt a program. They're looking to adopt a solution that can give them the talent that they need. That's what they're looking for. So two things is, #1, there are so many agencies in the public workforce system, so many community-based organizations, so many grant-funded initiatives, that you have to work together. So to make it so it's not confusing to the employer. So we had a core team of employers, community colleges, K-12, tech centers, apprenticeship representatives who work closely with the state, and we tried to keep a really good strategy as best we could to be working in tandem, and how we would go about presenting referrals to each other. So that was #1. But the most important, really, for the company is to listen. You know, we need to know, I agree exactly with the consultative sales approach. You need to know what it is that they need. You know, you're not selling a program, you are helping to develop solutions to problems that employers have. And too often in this workspace, folks are selling programs. That's not what we should be doing. We should be delivering solutions that are tailor-made for them.
That's great. Thank you, Debbie. So Melissa, same questions to you, and we can maybe sort of combine them. So what steps did you follow to build a new partnership with Bay State Health? How did you approach them, and what do you think really kind of sold them on partnering with you?
Sure. So first, Debbie, great answers. And I think a lot of the work that we did, we found, very similar in terms of our process. First off, in the state of Massachusetts, we've had a long-standing relationship with employers around on-the-job training. We get a lot of our funding and utilize that to work with employers around that. And as most of us realize, registered apprenticeship is the on-the-job training, the work process part, and it's only enhanced by adding that related technical instruction. So we started to work with a few of our employers who we felt were safe employers, Bay State Health being one of them. Bay State Health has been a longstanding employer that has looked at models like registered apprenticeship because it's more of a long-term strategy to increase their pipeline and to increase the skills of their current pipeline. So for us, it was a no-brainer. We sat at the table early on with Bay State Health and worked with each different department within the healthcare system to identify their greatest need and to look at working with both incumbent workers and new workers in many of those fields. And I think, like you said, Debbie, it's, the employer needs to understand the model, but also be really involved and believe in it. We're all looking to increase our workforce and to gain the skills of people. So working with a model like this just seemed to, make sense. The other thing that I'll say is once we found a champion and we were able to do that in different, in advanced manufacturing and then also in healthcare, it made the work a little bit easier because employers really tend to understand and listen to other employers better. So once we had that opportunity and people, had some experience, they were able to share that, and it really created a different type of buy-in from other employers. And the other thing that I just wanted to say, and you touched on this, Debbie, is just the opportunity with registered apprenticeship to really have the employer train their own specifically to their need. So not just within the industry, but maybe it's the specific type of machinery they make or the specific type of healthcare training they need for a pharmacy technician or something of that nature, where coming out of school with education is great, but sometimes those needs aren't quite parallel to what the business needs. So all of those things I think have really helped just in terms of marketing and engaging employers.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So let's move on to job seekers and marketing to job seekers. And we'll just sort of combine a couple questions here. So what are the key selling points that most resonate with prospective participants to become apprentices, and what does your recruitment process look like? And then we can start with you, Melissa.
Sure. So obviously for everyone, it's different. We did a lot of our work recruiting both through our career centers, but also with the employers that we were working with. It became clear in the beginning that incumbent worker training was definitely of a need. So you may have had people who were in either a lower paying job or a job that they weren't really happy with. So they would utilize the registered apprenticeship to get training and move up within that organization. But really, I think the fact that you're getting paid while you're learning, you also know when you start an apprenticeship that you're going to have increases in your wages over time. There's also a lot of people out there who normal traditional school may not be for them, and apprenticeship brings a really different dynamic because you have a mentor, someone who's kind of teaching you on the floor, so to speak, and then whatever type of training, whether it's didactic training that the employer has created or maybe a training vendor is brought in to do that training. I think that allows people who, again, may not want to take the path of going to college, having debt, having all of those things. It's really an easy sell, and I hate to use the word sell, but I think that there's just so many benefits to apprenticeships, and those are just a few of them.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Debbie, what would you like to add to that in terms of how you marketed apprenticeship to job seekers and kind of how you recruited them into the program?
Well, I would say amen to everything that was previously said, Melissa. And part of what we were doing was increasing the awareness of apprenticeship with the general population. So we did TV commercials, we did radio spots, we did campaigns, specific campaigns to try to raise awareness. So especially with career coaches for students in high schools, so they could see they had choices. They have choices. They could go to college and pursue an apprenticeship, or pursue an apprenticeship. And so trying to increase awareness of those options was really helpful. But I'd say not one of the best awareness that we had, again, with Hershey, was through a boot camp strategy where Hershey, kind of went out on a limb and worked with us, supporting them and designing this boot camp. And we advertised this as strongly as we could. We went through chamber. Every place where we could do a presentation, we did a presentation for both employers and for apprentices, and tried to get the word out that there were options, in addition to all the job centers and so forth. And also through the colleges. We had sessions with students in classes where those classes were already in line to be in an apprenticeship occupation. And tried all sorts of engagement to bring the employers and the students, potential apprentices, together to try to get them connected and get on that path.
Great. Thank you both. I think we have time to get to our employers briefly. I just want to ask them on the marketing front. We're going to talk a little bit more later with our employers about the benefits of doing the apprenticeship program. But before we get to that, Diane, when you and Bay State Health were first approached by MassHire, you didn't know exactly what the benefits of this particular apprenticeship would end up being. What really convinced you this is a good idea to do? What did they say that made you say, yeah, we should do this, it's worth the effort?
Sure. So when Bay State Health was approached by Melissa to do a registered apprenticeship, there were a few things that really stuck out to Bay State as MassHire was a partner. We would see as a partner in this. So having somebody help us navigate a bit more around the apprenticeship standards and aligning the apprenticeship to those standards, ensure we're meeting them. So really someone that can go back and forth with questions to the Department of Apprenticeship Standards regarding oversight, especially relating to a non-traditional trade. So Bay State Health really focuses on the healthcare occupations, which was something new to the apprenticeship world. So it was very much saw it as an opportunity to work with MassHire to partner and work on the developing of a non-traditional trade apprenticeship program, and having them MassHire as a partner to provide that technical assistance when necessary, brokering some of those conversations between Bay State Health and the Department of Apprenticeship Standards. So we very much saw it as an opportunity and a partner to really promote something that was not, that you typically would not see in a healthcare field, in healthcare occupation.
Great. Thanks, Diane. Christy, same question to you. What kind of sold you and Hershey on partnering with Shenandoah Valley to develop this apprenticeship?
Well, we were really open to ideas because we had tapped out our local market and the temporary agencies, and they just weren't yielding the results that we needed. So when Debbie approached us with the industrial manufacturing apprenticeship, it was just really a forward-looking approach. It was not something we had considered. We were able to look at the apprenticeship as a way to recruit manufacturing employees and give them on-the-job training, of course, with specialized skills. Again, just a fresh approach to fill our pipeline. Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board, essentially they held our hand. They helped us through the entire process of developing the apprenticeship, which in return made it a lot less intimidating. We were able to mold the apprenticeship into something that was going to work for us, with tailor-made in-house training. And essentially, the employees were able to get paid while they learned, and that was just essential for us.
Great. Thank you, Christy. So that concludes this part of our panel discussion. We will be back with more from our expert panelists. Right now, though, I'd like to turn it over to Doug Walton at APT and Daniel Keene with Urban. They're going to talk about what the research study told us about the benefits of apprenticeship to participants and employers. So, Doug.
Great, thanks, David. So to understand the benefits of registered apprenticeship for apprentices, the evaluation examined a large number of outcomes for AAI apprentices. I'm going to show findings for 3 of these outcomes today. These 3 outcomes are program completion, post-program employment, and earnings growth. So on this slide, we show outcomes for completion. We show program enrollment status as reported by apprentices in the AAI Apprentice Survey. We conducted this survey about 3 years after AAI apprentices began their programs. So think of this slide as a snapshot of program status 3 years after apprentices began their programs. We show all apprentices in the top row, and then we break out by gender and race ethnicity. So at the time of the survey, about half, 47%, of all apprentices had completed their programs. That's the teal bar. And 33% were still enrolled. That's the orange set of bars. Just 20% were no longer in their programs, either because they left without completing, 15% in the purple bars, or they had their programs canceled by the employer or sponsor. That was 5% in the green set of bars. We found some differences by subgroup. We found that a larger share of women apprentices reported that they had completed their programs compared to men. 61% of women had completed compared to just 43% of men. We found that this reflects the predominance of women in healthcare apprenticeships, which on average were shorter than other apprenticeship programs. We also found that at similar rates of all racial and ethnic groups had completed or were still enrolled in their programs. So our key takeaway from this finding is that in general, most apprentices were making successful progress in their programs, having either completed or still registered and on track in their programs at the time of the survey. Next slide, please. So the second post-program outcome we looked at was employment. So this slide shows the employment status of AAI apprentices as reported in the apprentice survey. And here we're looking only at apprentices who completed their programs. So starting with the top row, among those who completed their programs, nearly 2/3, 65%, the orange set of bars, were employed with the same employer who operated the apprenticeship. So 65% remained employed with the same employer who operated the program. Another 25% were enrolled with a different firm. That's the teal set of bars. And 10% were not employed, the green set of bars. We found little difference in employment retention between men and women. Among racial and ethnic subgroups, we found that Black apprentices had the lowest rate of retention with the employer who operated the program. 54% remained with the same employer. Black apprentices also had the highest rate of non-employment at 15%. And apprentices of other races had the lowest rate of non-employment, just 3%. Next slide, please. For the third and final outcome that we'll talk about today, we looked at earnings. So in this slide, we report growth in average earnings for apprentices between 2 time points, 1 year before starting their apprenticeship program through 1 year after the end of their apprenticeship program. These averages include both completers and those who left without completing, as well as apprentices with 0 earnings. An important caveat to mention is that these are not program impacts. These results don't show that AAI necessarily caused growth in earnings. To establish causation, we would need a control group, which is sort of beyond the scope of the study. That said, we did compare earnings growth for AAI apprentices against a benchmark group of similar workers, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. So with that said, the main finding is that AAI apprentices experience substantial earnings gains between the year before starting their programs and the year after program ends. AEI apprentices on average earned a bit more than $35,000 in the year before their program started. That's the orange line on the left-hand side. By the time their program ended, the right-hand side, earnings had increased to almost $53,000, so a growth of about 50%. We found that earnings grew more for women than men. Annual earnings for women grew by about $19,000. For men, they grew by about $16,000. So we observe a narrowing of the gender wage gap between men and women, both in dollar terms and also in percentage terms. Next slide, please. As I hinted on the previous slide, we conducted an analysis to compare earnings growth for AEI apprentices to earnings growth for similar workers who are not apprentices, to put into context sort of the magnitude of this earnings growth. To construct the comparison group, we used data from the US Census Bureau, and we calculated average earnings for workers of a similar characteristics, so similar age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, geography, so similar workers to AEI apprentices. And we looked quarter by quarter, starting 4 quarters before the program through 10 years. 4 quarters before starting the program through 10 quarters after starting the program. Again, this is not an experimental comparison, so we can't for sure say that AEI caused any differences in earnings. So the goal of this analysis is just to put these earnings numbers into some context. And overall, we found that in general, AEI apprentices experienced faster earnings growth than comparison group workers. We can look first at women apprentices. Those are the blue lines. The women apprentices in the solid blue line experienced 62% growth in earnings over this time period. And that was much faster than the comparison group of non-apprentices. That's the dashed blue line. Women in that group experienced just 19% growth in earnings. And we saw similar findings, for various groups, gender, race, ethnicity. On this slide, we show earnings growth for men. So for apprentices, AEI apprentices, men experienced 36% earnings growth compared to 15% for men in the comparison group. So again, the key finding is that AEI apprentices experienced faster earnings growth than the comparison group workers. And to reiterate the finding we saw on the previous slide, we see a narrowing of the gender wage gap between men and women in apprenticeship. Next slide, please. So this slide shows earnings growth again, this time by race and ethnicity. We found that all groups experience earnings growth between the year before starting the program and the year after program end. Growth was highest for apprentices of other races who experienced 86% growth in earnings. That's the purple line. Next highest were Hispanic apprentices who experienced 50% growth. White apprentices experienced 45% growth, and Black apprentices experienced 37% growth. We investigated these differences a bit, and we found that much of the difference in earnings growth between racial and ethnic groups is linked with the specific occupations in which apprentices participated in. For example, we found that Black women were much more likely to participate in lower paying healthcare occupations, for example, pharmacy technician, than were white women. White women were much more likely to participate in higher paying healthcare occupations like registered nursing. So there's an important intersection between race, ethnicity, gender, and occupation in which participants receive training. And I think that's an important topic for future investigation in this area. Next slide, please. This slide shows earnings growth by occupation, which as I discussed on the previous slide, is closely linked to race, ethnicity, and to gender. There were some substantial differences in growth between different occupations. Most striking is computer IT, that's the red line. Apprentices in this occupation earned about $22,000 in the year before starting their program. That grew to nearly $62,000 in the year after their program. So apprentices in this occupation experienced a very large increase in earnings. Apprentices in healthcare, the purple line, saw the second largest increase, earnings for apprentices in this group nearly doubled from about 25,000 to about 50,000. And notably, these two occupations, computer IT and healthcare, were much more common among women apprentices and apprentices of other races, which on the previous slide, we saw these two groups had the highest earnings growth among compared to men and compared to other racial and ethnic groups. So again, there's this important sort of intersection between occupation, race, ethnicity, and gender. So just to reiterate the main finding, in general, AEI apprentices experienced substantial earnings growth over this period, the year before starting their program and the year after program end. So that wraps up the slides related to benefits for apprentices. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Keene to discuss the benefits of registered apprenticeship for employers.
Thanks, Doug. All right, next slide. So although apprenticeship has substantial benefits for the apprentices themselves that Doug just described, it's important to remember that a lot of the direct costs of apprenticeship are borne by the employers. So to understand the costs and benefits of apprenticeship training for employers, we conducted a survey of 68 employers of AAI apprentices. These employers didn't come from a random sample of the total group of AAI employers, but they did represent a broad cross-section of employers working with AAI grantees. The employer survey is an important contribution to what we know about the employer return on investment in apprenticeship because prior research has been limited to only a handful of employers in any given study. And these analyses also generally exclude the indirect benefits that we studied, which I'll talk more about. The employer survey asked questions about employer characteristics, direct costs that they paid, and the productivity of apprentices. We refer to the increased value that the employers gain from apprentices' contribution to production as the direct productivity benefits. But the survey also asks about 10 indirect benefits, and these are things like reduced turnover or an improved pipeline for future managers. And we found, and I'll show you in a couple slides, that these indirect benefits were really important to the value of apprenticeship for employers. Many of these benefits are difficult to measure, so I really want to emphasize that these are estimates, and we want to be modest about our findings. Our overall finding is that registered apprenticeship generates positive net benefits for most employers, and that 2 out of 3 surveyed employers recoup their investments in apprenticeship within 5 years after the end of their program. Next slide. So I want to start by summarizing the major in-program costs of registered apprentices for employers. So this is while the apprentice is still in the program. As you can see, and as you probably might have guessed, total apprentice compensation, including both wages and benefits, is the single largest cost of the apprenticeship program, with an average value of over $87,000. Other significant costs include the related instruction tuition and fees at almost $4,500 on average, and the cost of the mentor's lost productivity because they're spending time with the apprentice, and that's $11,000. Note that for all of these costs, the mean is higher than the median. And so this indicates that there's a right skew in the apprenticeship costs. So that means that there's a small number of employers with very high costs that are skewing the data. Next slide. So these costs are actually relatively easy to document. Benefits are more difficult. For example, it's difficult for an employer to quantify for us the value of an individual apprentice's contribution to production. So to estimate the value of an apprentice's contribution to production, we follow prior studies, ROI studies, and ask employers how productive an apprentice is compared to a fully qualified worker on their staff. And then we multiplied this percent by the wages of that fully qualified worker. What we learned when we talked to the 68 employers is that it's very difficult for employers to identify what a fully qualified worker means. So we used 3 different estimates for the apprentice's productivity. The lowest estimate uses the employer's report of the wages of a qualified worker, which was typically lower wage non-apprentice peer. Our medium estimate uses the highest of either the employer's report of that qualified worker or the apprentice's own post-completion wage when they're done with the program. And then our high value estimate uses the mentor wage as the fully qualified worker benchmark. If we focus on the median of our medium estimate of the value of the apprentice's productivity, so this is kind of the preferred medium estimate from the analysis, we find that the gross value of their contribution to production was a little over $52,000. So this is the benefit to the employer before taking out all the apprentice wage costs and benefit costs. We focus on these medians rather than the averages in our report because we found that some employers reported really extreme values for both costs and benefits. So taking that 50th percentile helped to focus the analysis. Some employers reported much higher or lower values for the apprentice's productivity during the program. The value of the apprentice's productivity for the 25th percentile employer was just over $36,000, while for the 75th percentile employer, it was over $100,000 in benefits. Median indirect benefits, so those benefits to things like turnover or pipeline from managers, experienced by the employer after the apprenticeship program were over twice as high as the median direct productivity benefits. Median total benefits in the post-program period, so that's after the apprenticeship was done, were over $35,000. Next slide. All right, so when we put all these pieces together, those in-program costs I showed you, the in-program direct benefits and also the indirect benefits, and then the post-program benefits to employers, the median total net benefit for employers of AI apprentices was over $17,000. And so that's circled in purple in this graph. This slide also demonstrates the importance of indirect benefits, such as the reduced turnover and improved pipeline of managers for employers. When we remove those indirect benefits from our estimate, which is shown in the teal bar, our median net benefit estimates would actually be negative for the median estimate of the value of the apprentice's productivity. So these indirect benefits matter a lot in a positive return on investment of apprenticeship for employers. Next slide. Right, this slide shows the same numbers as the last slide, but it shows the wide variation that we saw in our net benefits across different occupations. Advanced manufacturing programs had the largest median net benefit. You'll see when we focus on these employers, it's over $100,000. All other programs, particularly healthcare, experienced much smaller benefits. The positive net benefits for advanced manufacturing were strongly driven, again, by those indirect benefits that I had mentioned. Next slide. Right. And another way to think about the benefits of apprenticeship to employers is to calculate their return on investment, which is just the difference between the benefits and the costs. That's the net benefits that I showed in the last two graphs, and dividing that by the costs. This can be thought of as a rate of return on investment in apprenticeship, and it can be compared to other rates of return on investment. The median return on investment for the 68 employers that we looked at was 44.3%. So this means that for every $100 invested in the apprenticeship program, employers enjoyed $144 in total benefits. In our report, we also compare our estimate to prior return on investment research. And while other major studies have found that these ROIs are between 40 and 50%. So we saw significant variation in our sample of 68 employers. In general, our 44% estimate that we found aligns with prior research. Next slide. Right, the panel discussion.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Doug. So let's transition back to our panelists again, if you all wouldn't mind jumping back on video so we can see you. So now that we've heard about the evaluation findings on how the AAI apprenticeships benefited both job seekers and employers, let's learn about the specific experience of our experts. And we'll start with our employer partners. And Christy, let's start with you. Can you tell us briefly how the apprenticeship program is going today? And more specifically, if you can touch on what the benefits have been to Hershey of doing this, both more bottom line benefits as well as kind of the more hard to quantify benefits.
Okay, so what it looks like today, it's just a paid hands-on practical on-the-job training. One thing we really wanted to tap into was not how you do something, but the why. And this gave us an opportunity to really dig into that. Now, as employees retire, we have a stable, reliable influx of qualified personnel to rely on, especially in this crazy labor market that we're experiencing right now. So that was really important to us. A lot of the benefits, some are, we're able to quantify, some I'd say we're not. I'm going to use a quote from Milton Hershey. Man accomplishes little when he thinks and acts alone. You know, the Shenandoah Valley Workforce Development Board was a dedicated partner with us, and the Wilson Workforce Center, which also led us to hire employees that had barriers to employment, and we were able to include them in our apprenticeship, because Hershey really has a people-first manufacturing vision. You know, our manufacturing operations are our most critical part of our business, and it's really the heartbeat of our company. So I believe it came with, you know, a significant commitment, but it came with rewards. So financially, we were able to fund on-the-job training and upskill our employees. Some of the more hard to quantify things, I think, is just pride. You know, the pride that comes from achieving a journeyman's card. You know, a lot of our workforce, you know, doesn't have formal education kind of beyond a GED or a high school diploma. So now they have this journeyman's card that's, you know, a portable national credential. And the pride when you're able to give those is just, I feel like, immeasurable.
Great. Thank you, Christy. So same question to you, Diane. How are things going with your apprenticeship today, and what have been the benefits to your company of doing the apprenticeship program?
Sure. So the apprenticeship model has definitely grown at Bay State over the last couple of years, and we have grown in terms of the occupations that we are, you know, building apprenticeships around. So for instance, we have the monitor techs, the medical assistants. We are underway to look at a surgical technician training program and apprenticeship model, which if you said this to us 5 years ago, you know, it would be hard to kind of imagine apprenticing some of these occupations. So really, you know, changing that mindset and really having Bay State as, you know, a lead training healthcare facility and senior leadership is very much on board with the apprenticeship model. It's something that's hasn't always been done here, and now we are doing it more and more with various healthcare occupations. It provides structure and support to the apprentices. So this has both been incumbent workers and externals hires to the organization. And the feedback we're receiving is the apprentices feel very supported, and there's a clear defined path of what they need to do to accomplish that next step and to progress up, if you will, within the organization. So I would say from a recruitment and retention standpoint, it's been very beneficial to Bay State. We have looked at entry-level workers and then enrolled them in an apprenticeship program to provide them that upward mobility. And the benefit of an apprenticeship also is you don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel. So you can take a training or a model that's working in your organization and then build an apprenticeship around it. So, you know, looking at the training that you have in-house and how can you develop an apprenticeship around that to provide that extra level of support has been, you know, really hard to quantify benefit. But we have definitely seen that in a recruitment and retention standpoint, along with, you know, job satisfaction, both to the employee as well as to the team that has the employee, the apprentice on their units. So from Bay State standpoint, you know, every occupation that we're developing training programs around and opportunities, it's the question of, you know, could you develop an apprenticeship around this occupation and provide that extra support and structure?
Great, thanks, Diane. And just to follow up on that, if you were sitting down with one of your colleagues at another employer and telling them about why they might consider setting up an apprenticeship program like yours, what would you tell them why they should do it, and what a first step might be to pursue setting something up?
Sure. So I would say the first step, as I mentioned, you know, you don't have to recreate a wheel, if you will. So for instance, you know, the operations monitor tech role that we have at Bay State, we took training that we had and we talked to Mass Hire and our nursing leaders and our clinical leaders and said, how can we develop an apprenticeship around this? You know, what's working and how can we do this? And I think, you know, Mass Hire has been a great partner with helping us navigate also to ensure that what we are thinking and in terms of what we're looking to do makes sense and aligns appropriately to the apprenticeship standards. So I would say it's a great opportunity to design a program around a training you already have someone in place or that you really want to promote a career pathway within your organization. There was some additional funding to offset some of that cost for training and supervision that was available to us on a per apprentice basis, which was very helpful, which we did speak to Mass Hire about. So again, just finding that partner to work with you to really develop how it's going to benefit not only the apprentice, but also your organization from a training and building your pipeline standpoint. So it's, at this point, we are looking at, really thinking outside the box of what occupations do we have that we could build a pre-apprentice model or apprentice model around, and what does that look like for both an organization as well as for the employee.
Great, thanks, Diane. Christy, same question. If you were sitting down with a colleague at another company, what would you say about why do apprenticeship and how they could get started?
I'm going to piggyback on a lot of what she just said. In the end, you just need to do it. It's an opportunity to upskill your employees, and it really, I'm going to say what she did. It gives your employees a career path, and I'm glad we took that leap. It was scary at first, because it becomes very intimidating. But if you've got somebody that's a good partner with, it becomes less intimidating. At the end of the day, you need to do it. I mean, there's so many intrinsic and extrinsic benefits to this.
Great, thanks, Christy. And let's turn now to our workforce training partners. And let's start with you, Debbie. What have been the benefits to apprentices of participating in the program?
I think for apprentices, for just as a whole, it gives them more connection to their employer. They feel more confident that they are better trained because with a consistent on-the-job training plan, consistent instruction, real engagement of mentors who care about their job performance and care about them doing a good job, it just increases their confidence. And that is extremely important. If you know that someone's counting on you, you know that you're improving, you know that there's engagement, you're going to be more likely to be at work and more likely to want to progress. It becomes just a big part of the culture. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is for individuals who were sitting on the sidelines, particularly individuals with disabilities, people who maybe were justice involved or had real barriers to getting in. This gives them a path to gain those skills with good apprenticeship programs that have partners with the workforce board or other community-based organizations that can help them with supportive services. There are wraparound services to help them be successful. So it gives them a true path to get to those jobs and those occupations and progress beyond that. So we saw some real evidences, Christy knows, we saw some real good stories and success stories, individuals with disabilities who were just collecting, Social Security and disability payments, and now they are in high-paid careers, buying houses, having children. It's just changed the trajectory of their lives, and that can happen when you have a registered apprenticeship program that is truly has become a part of the culture of the company and the community.
That's great, Debbie. Thank you. Same question to you, Melissa. What have been the benefits to apprentices that you've seen participating in your apprenticeship program?
I got nothing left. Everybody gave all the good answers. Literally everything that people just said, including the employers. The one thing that I think is a benefit that wasn't mentioned is for some of the related technical instruction component, some apprenticeship programs actually include going and taking course credit at colleges. So maybe it's only 150 hours, but maybe they take a 3-credit course. So for some folks, that's actually enticing, and it encourages them to go back to school and get a different degree or get a further degree. So, I mean, that's a whole different side of, upskilling the workforce. But I think too, and just going back to a little bit of the data that was talked about earlier is, we can talk about all of the very basic, wage increases, new jobs, these types of things, but it's all the underlying things that really make people more productive and, liking your job, liking the people that you work with, having your supervisors, like their employees because they're interested in it and they're learning. And I think for a lot of employers, having the opportunity to actually teach them legitimately what they need to know in that job. I mentioned it before, but I think it brings a very different dynamic than taking someone who went to a training program, came out, and now they still have to train them on, skills that they did not learn while they were trained somewhere else previously. So I just think that better environment, and that goes back to the ROI, which is people stay longer, people are happier, people are way more productive. And again, I think everybody else pretty much mentioned the benefits.
That's great. Thanks, Melissa. And thanks everyone for a super interesting panel discussion. We're going to go to our Q&A now. So we go to our next slide here. So again, please enter any questions you have in the chat. They can be for our research team, for our expert panelists. If they're directed to someone specific, if you can indicate generally who that is or specifically who that is, that would be great. I do think we had one or two earlier questions that we can get to while people are hopefully entering their current questions. One question we had early on, which is, what is the most effective outreach platform that you found? And I'm assuming this is for reaching potential participants. So why don't we let Debbie and then Melissa maybe address that? Most effective outreach platform.
I would say for us, it was Facebook. Now this is a while ago, but it was Facebook and the high school career coaches, and really trying to put little messages. We had one of Hershey's apprentices who gave a little quick video. And the candidates or potential job seekers, they could see someone who looked very much like them, who had been able to be very successful and was in a good career. So spotlighting those success stories, I think, through whatever social media that you can was really helpful.
Great, Melissa, same question.
Sure. I think for us, it was a multi-prong approach. I mean, Massachusetts was so new to non-traditional trades that everything from events, some of them were legislative events because as Massachusetts created an opportunity for employers to get a tax break, it became every way, like I said, so it might have been a manufacturing event that was being held, and apprenticeship became part of it. Some of it was advertising through or marketing through Division of Apprenticeship Standards in Massachusetts, and they were communicating information to our employers, our career centers, really trying to educate people. There was information that was out on buses for a while, and different external marketing opportunities. But it really just seemed like it was a multi-prong approach. And once kind of the ball got rolling and people started understanding, it was really more about that person to person, that employer champion who was able to communicate more one-on-one with some of our employers to really get them to understand what the benefits were.
Okay, great. So we had a question earlier as well about where to get training for the apprenticeship program manager. And I believe it was when Diane and Christy were talking. So I'm assuming that's a role at the employer. And there was a related question about how much train the trainer is involved with that position. So can one of you talk about the apprenticeship program manager role?
Sure. So we were fortunate. I mentioned Jerry Ghazi in the beginning. Again, Massachusetts being new to non-traditional trades and workforce boards being very new to communicating this to kind of the outside world. Jerry Ghazi happened to be a national guru. A lot of his information is out there. He worked with Department of Labor. But I think the other thing is our state agency in Massachusetts is who we went to, and they have staff who help to provide training and information. And then eventually it became training a trainer. So there's a few of us in different workforce boards who are pretty knowledgeable about registered apprenticeships. So we train other folks. I would suggest looking to see if your state has a state agency that's dedicated to Division of Apprenticeship Standards. If not, try to connect with DOL. If not, I'm always happy to share any information. We do have guides that we were given by Department of Labor and by our state agency that might be helpful to other folks. So that would be my suggestion, to look both within your state, but then in addition, kind of at the national level.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Okay, we have a question about funding. Are there any similar funding opportunities that will be available so more people can grow apprenticeship programs? And I'm wondering if this is a question for the APT urban team, if you're aware of any funding opportunities like AAI.
So
Go ahead, Daniel.
the Apprenticeship Building America grants have been the most recent, and they were released this summer. But there's been every couple of years a series of similar grant programs from the U.S. Department of Labor. So I would keep an eye on the apprenticeship.gov website for future RFPs for similar grant programs.
And I think apprenticeship is gaining traction with other federal agencies as well. So there are apprenticeship opportunities coming out, I know, through HRSA, which is within the Department of Health and Human Services, and possibly others as well.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Do you both employ marketing firms? I'm thinking this is for Debbie and Melissa. If so, how did you choose them? I.e., did they have a background in this space?
From our standpoint, we just had an individual on retainer who helped do press releases and so forth when we needed them, with no background really in this area, but had skills to know how to use social media and how to get press releases written and issued and so forth. So we did not hire a firm for that, other than just the one person who was on retainer anyway for public relations activities.
Okay. Melissa, did you use a marketing firm for anything?
Our organization per se didn't, but working with the state of Massachusetts, there were different point in times where there were projects being done where they incorporated registered apprenticeship. The person was not an expert in registered apprenticeship. It was more about content and about how to, market and communicate it. So it was minimal, and it wasn't someone we hired directly.
Okay, great. I want to make sure everybody sees in the chat, we have a couple people offering resources for potential funding for apprenticeship, going back to the funding question. So just make sure you look at those. We have a question, an interesting question. How was the program affected when COVID started, and has it recovered? And the individual is saying, we started an apprenticeship program just as COVID hit, and it seems like they can't gain momentum that many of you have spoken about. So really, any of you could probably address the question of how the pandemic has impacted your apprenticeship program.
I'll throw in that COVID, like most bad things that happen, there's learnings that you have to gain. You cannot just be defeated by something bad that happens. And so, what we saw really with all of our educators was that in trying, maybe for a decade, in trying to get more flexible with the instruction, all of a sudden they had to, because one of the biggest issues that employers have with community college instruction in particular is that the lack of flexibility. Well, when COVID came, then suddenly, you know, over a course of just a very short period of time, colleges had to get very good at that. They had to, because that was the only way they were going to be able to have classes conducted and get revenue and continue apprenticeship programs for employers. The other thing is that everybody became a lot more creative. So for underserved populations, and we're in a rural area. A lot of Virginia is very rural, and people don't have internet in their homes. So how could they continue? So community colleges and K-12 and adult tech centers and so forth, they advertised that people could just come to their parking lot and log in, so that's how some of them continued their instruction. In the more so in like the IT area, we discovered, as everyone knows, that a lot of jobs can be done remotely. An awful lot of jobs can, and that's certainly not as pervasive now, but a lot of those jobs will stay, and that really helps rural folks as well, because they can earn higher incomes and stay right in their area.
I would add, from an employer partner perspective, we have been successful in running apprenticeship programs through COVID. For instance, medical assisting, there is an apprenticeship program built around that, and there was a successful cohort that just finished actually. And it was a pretty lengthy program. Along with our OA monitor techs, we did have apprentices during COVID. And I do think, being in healthcare, individuals are expected to work in the hospital, if you will, during COVID, and there was definitely a need. So just growing our pipeline, there was a huge emphasis on that. From the training perspective, we did work with our training providers, for instance, Holyoke Community College and some of the other local colleges, and had to do remote learning and things where there were barriers. But ultimately, we worked with the candidates a bit more one-on-one to ensure that they were meeting the requirements of the related technical instruction and work processes. So I would say we were successful in, continuing them during COVID. And most of those apprentices, half were internal and half were external, in terms of incumbent workers and external hires.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we are through our questions, so let's go to a poll on our next slide here. So we want to ask you to respond to this final poll question that's going to help APT as we continue to offer research and technical assistance on implementing high quality apprenticeship programs. We want to know, what specific topics related to apprenticeship do you want to learn more about that you think will make the biggest difference in your work? If you can enter a word or two in the box, we'd really appreciate it. And then hit send. Let's give it about 5 more seconds, 10 more seconds. Oh, now they're trickling in again. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll, see what we got. Funding is, not surprisingly, a big topic. Equity, employers, and technology apprenticeship. So thank you for those. We'll keep those in mind as we go forward and look at opportunities for more research in areas where we can be helpful. So let's go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide. So yes, to wrap up, for those of you who want to access more information, we are including the links here. I believe we also put them in the chat so you can get them. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out this PowerPoint. You can access the links at that time as well. These are the full reports that we were referencing. You can also join APP's mailing list on this link if you want to be notified of events like these or our latest research in workforce and economic mobility or other areas. You can sign up here. We anticipate holding another learning event late in winter. We're putting that together, so you'll want to hear about that. Final slide. So here's my contact information. If you have any follow-up questions about what you heard or interested in talking more about research and TA, or you want to get in touch with anybody, I can sort of be the conduit. So please reach out to me and I'll make sure you get your question answered or get to the right person. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Lizzie and Doug, as well as Daniel from Urban. And I'd also like to really thank our panelists, Melissa, Diane, Debbie, and Christy, for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share with you today. And for those listening, thank you for joining us today, and thanks for your time. And that concludes our event. Have a great afternoon.